She says she wants love, connection, emotional depth. So why does she always fall for the man who gives her none of it? The one who stays just out of reach, the one whose silence keeps her awake, the one who never really needs her, but somehow owns her thoughts. Is this desire, or is it a wound disguised as attraction? Why does emotional distance feel more addictive than closeness? Why does the man who doesn't chase become the one she can't stop chasing? Freud had a theory. He believed we don't desire what's safe. We desire what's missing, what we lacked, what still haunts us. Desire, he said, isn't about fulfillment. It's about absence. So what if love isn't about connection at all? What if it's about reenactment? What if we're not falling for people? We're falling into patterns. The rare man, the cold man, the emotionally unavailable man, he's not irresistible because of who he is. He's irresistible because of what he withholds. And to the unconscious mind, that absence doesn't feel like danger. It feels like destiny. But here's the question. If you finally stop chasing what's rare, what kind of love might actually feel real? Desire doesn't grow in comfort, it grows in absence. This was Freud's radical claim, that we're not driven by what we possess, but by what eludes us, by the thing just beyond reach, the feeling we can almost taste, but never fully touch. And nowhere is this more evident than in who we choose to love. According to Freud, women are not irrational for desiring emotionally unavailable men. They are responding to something deeper than logic, something unconscious. These men, these so-called rare men, don't just stand out because they're mysterious or distant. They symbolize something more, the promise of filling an ancient, unhealed void. They represent a challenge, not just romantic, but existential. A man who doesn't need you activates something primal, not because he's superior, but because he awakens the fantasy of being the one woman who finally changes him. The one who melts the cold exterior, the one who proves her worth by earning what no one else could. It's not about connection, it's about conquest. And here's where Freud's theory cuts even deeper. What if the person you're chasing isn't your future, just a reflection of your past in disguise? Stay with me, because what comes next might not just explain your patterns, it might expose them. What if the man isn't the goal at all? What if he's a projection of something older, something rooted in early childhood dynamics? A distant father, an emotionally inconsistent caregiver, a model of love that always felt like chasing approval rather than receiving it freely. This is how scarcity becomes attractive, how emotional unavailability becomes eroticized, because it mirrors the original wound, the first experience of reaching out and being met with silence. Freud called this repetition compulsion, the unconscious desire to recreate the original pain, hoping for a different outcome, to rewrite the ending, to win this time. But the rules never change. The emotionally unavailable man never gives. And the cycle repeats again and again. This isn't biology. It's psycho-emotional programming. It's not about hormones. It's about hunger. A hunger that was never fed, a need that was never met. So when she falls for the man who doesn't need her, it's not about him. It's about a missing piece inside her that hopes, just this once, he'll reach back. But he never does, because he's not the cure. He's the mirror. Rarity creates value. It's one of the oldest psychological truths. What's scarce becomes sacred. The harder something is to obtain, the more our minds convince us it must be worth having. In economics, it's called the scarcity principle. In marketing, it's how they sell luxury. In relationships, it becomes a trap. Modern psychology tells us that we instinctively place higher value on things we can't easily access. This is true with objects, status, and even people, especially people. So when a man appears emotionally distant, self-sufficient, or coldly independent, he signals something powerful. He doesn't need you. And because he doesn't need you, he becomes rare. Because he's rare, he becomes valuable. Not because of who he is, but because of what he withholds. And that's when the game begins. For some women, this scarcity triggers a deep psychological response. The subconscious sees a prize, an emotional status symbol, someone to win, not out of arrogance, but out of a deeply buried belief that the harder something is to attain, the more it must mean once it's yours. This isn't romantic, it's primal. Evolutionarily, humans have been wired to compete for high-value mates, not just based on looks or wealth, but on perceived independence, emotional control, and social status. A man who is unaffected, unbothered, emotionally minimal, that man becomes a canvas for projection. He must be powerful. He must have options. He must be worth it. And so he becomes desirable, not despite his distance, but because of it. Modern dating has only intensified this dynamic. Social media makes everyone visible, but availability becomes rare. The more detached he is, the more desirable he seems. Not because of who he loves, but because of who he refuses to love. Scarcity becomes the illusion of superiority, and the chase becomes a performance, where worth is determined not by mutual affection, but by who cracks first. In this twisted mirror, the most emotionally distant man becomes the one everyone wants, not because he offers love, but because he never does. Attraction isn't random, it feels spontaneous, even magical. But beneath the surface, it's often a reenactment, a psychological echo from long before we ever learned what love was supposed to feel like. Freud believed that love is not a choice, it's a compulsion, shaped by memory, trauma, and unresolved emotion. We are drawn to what feels familiar, not necessarily what feels good. For many women, emotionally unavailable men don't feel foreign, they feel known. Because long before romance, there was another kind of relationship, the first one, the ones with caregivers, parents, or early authority figures. And if those figures were distant, inconsistent, critical, or cold, the blueprint was laid. A blueprint that says love isn't safe, that affection must be earned, that the ones who withhold are the ones worth chasing. This is repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate old wounds, hoping that this time the ending will change, that this time the cold figure will finally warm, that this time the love that was withheld will finally be given. But it never is, and yet the pattern continues. Because the brain doesn't crave resolution, it craves recognition. What feels familiar feels safe, even if it hurts. This is how trauma bonds form, not because someone is broken, but because part of them is still trying to fix what was never theirs to carry in the first place. Trauma bonding isn't weakness. It's the unconscious trying to heal itself the only way it knows how, by repeating what it remembers. So when she stays with the man who can't love her fully, she's not stupid. She's not blind. She's trying to finish a story that began long before he entered the scene. She's trying to win the love she never received. But healing doesn't come from replaying the past. It comes from recognizing it and choosing not to cast the same characters in the same roles. Again, because the only way to change the ending is to finally write a different story. Neediness repels. Not because kindness is unattractive, not because vulnerability is weakness, but because, on a psychological level, what is too available loses its edge. What is certain loses its pull. In the architecture of human desire, tension is everything. Freud believed the libido isn't drawn to comfort or closure. It's drawn to tension, distance, friction, to lack. That gap between what we want and what we can't quite reach, that's where desire lives. So what happens when a man gives everything too soon? When he's always available, always expressing how much he needs her, always chasing? He collapses the distance. He eliminates the mystery. There's no longer a void to fill, no emotional high-wire act, no thrill of pursuit. The desire dies, not because he's not good, but because he's too good, too predictable, too present. And so, paradoxically, the emotionally needy man often becomes invisible. Not because women crave cruelty, but because desperation kills polarity. It signals emotional dependency, not emotional strength. It feels less like connection and more like a burden. Compare him to the so-called rare man, the one who doesn't chase, who withholds, who seems to be orbiting his own world untethered. This detachment creates space, and in that space, the imagination takes over. He becomes an open loop the mind can't stop trying to close. He becomes a project, not because he's better, but because his absence creates longing. This flips modern dating advice on its head. You're told to be more open, more expressive, more communicative. But when that openness becomes overexposure, it backfires. Emotional saturation is not romantic. It's suffocating. Desire needs air. It needs tension. It needs the sense that something is still unfinished, still unfolding. So when a man overgives, overshares, overpursues, he removes the very thing that makes love seductive: uncertainty. And without uncertainty, there's no seduction, just security. And ironically, security without mystery becomes emotionally irrelevant. Because in the language of the unconscious, what is easily won is rarely desired. And what resists is remembered. We don't just fall in love with people, we fall in love with symbols. Symbols shaped by culture, wrapped in fantasy, and delivered to us through every screen we scroll. Look at the modern archetype of masculinity: the emotionally detached man, the brooding one, the lone wolf who never explains himself, the one who speaks less, stares more, and walks away before anyone can get too close. He's not just a character, he's a blueprint. From film noir to TikTok edits, the image repeats. The quiet man in control, the one who doesn't chase, who doesn't flinch, who doesn't feel, at least not openly. And this silence, this emotional withholding, is framed as power, as mystery, as seduction. It's not an accident. Freud believed that libido, our desire, our longing, is shaped not just by personal trauma, but by cultural myth. Society doesn't just influence what we think is attractive, it scripts it. It tells us what to want. And for decades, the script has been clear. Masculine means untouchable, which means emotional availability gets recoded as weakness. Vulnerability becomes emasculation. Softness gets cast as something to be ashamed of. And so what begins as fiction becomes aspiration. The media tells women that love is an unraveling, that behind every cold man is a heart waiting to be warmed, that her role is to be the one exception, the one who breaks through, the one who heals the broken. And the more he resists, the more worthy he seems. This isn't biology, it's conditioning. It's how power structures replicate themselves in romance, where closeness is seen as loss of control, and distance is framed as dominance. It's why so many fall in love with pain that looks like passion. Because culture teaches us that love should feel like a conquest, not a connection. So when women desire the emotionally distant man, they're not chasing him. They're chasing a cultural myth embedded deep inside the psyche. A myth that says the more he hides, the more valuable he must be. And a myth, when repeated often enough, stops sounding like a story and starts sounding like the truth. We like to think we choose who we're attracted to. But what if we're just following a script? A script written not by our hearts, but by our culture. By stories we've seen so many times, we start to confuse them with truth. Look at the way media portrays men, the ones we're told to admire, the cool, the confident, the rare. They don't cry, they don't beg, they don't talk about feelings. They're distant, untouchable, emotionally unavailable, and somehow that makes them irresistible. This isn't new. From classic Hollywood to Netflix thrillers, from music videos to curated Instagram personas, the emotionally aloof man is always positioned as the prize, the one everyone wants but no one can fully reach. He's mysterious, he's dominant, he's rare, and most importantly, he doesn't need anyone. That absence becomes his power. His silence becomes seductive. His lack of emotional expression becomes a symbol of control, of status, of strength. And Freud would argue, this isn't just fantasy. It's libido shaped by myth. Culture doesn't just tell us what to wear or how to speak. It teaches us what to want, what to chase, what to find desirable. So women aren't just falling for emotionally distant men. They're falling for the image culture told them was valuable. They're responding to decades of subliminal messaging that says, the more he withholds, the more he's worth. And it goes even deeper, because if masculinity is framed as distance, then vulnerability, openness, softness, emotional presence gets cast as weakness, as feminine. as disposable, which is why men who express need are often labeled too much, while men who express nothing are elevated as elite. We've been taught to romanticize pain, to mistake confusion for chemistry, to see emotional detachment not as dysfunction, but as depth. And in doing so, we absorb a blueprint that tells us love should feel like a challenge, a conquest, a reward for endurance. But what if that story is broken? What if real connection doesn't live in mystery, but in presence? And what if the man who doesn't need anyone isn't strong at all, but simply afraid to be seen? Now that the patterns are visible, the question becomes, what do you do with them? Freud believed that freedom doesn't come from avoidance. It comes from awareness, from dragging the unconscious into the light, from confronting the stories we've been living without even knowing we were in them. Because most people aren't choosing love. They're reenacting it. They're picking partners not from clarity, but from compulsion. Not because of who the other person is, but because of what they represent. A symbol, a mirror, a ghost from the past waiting to be rewritten. But here's the turning point. Once you see the script, you can stop acting it out. When you notice the attraction to emotional unavailability, pause. When you feel drawn to someone because they're distant, ask why. When the chase feels addictive, consider what part of you believes love must be earned to be real. This isn't about blaming women for their patterns. And it's not about demonizing men who protect their emotions. It's about stepping out of the trance. Because as long as we remain unconscious, we're not choosing, we're chasing, we're repeating, we're recreating a wound and calling it a romance. But the moment we become aware, really aware, we gain the ability to choose differently, to stop mistaking confusion for chemistry, to stop assigning value to people based on how little they need us, to stop falling for coldness wrapped in charm. Emotional clarity isn't weakness, and mystery isn't always depth. Sometimes it's just another way to hide. And real intimacy doesn't live in the man who makes you question your worth. It lives in the one who sees it, without you having to prove it. The work isn't about fixing others. It's about facing ourselves. Because the rarest thing in the world isn't a man who doesn't need anyone. It's a person who chooses love with their eyes wide open. Freud showed us the architecture of desire. He peeled back the polite masks of romance and exposed the raw machinery underneath, the shadows, the memories, the wounds we mistake for fate. He taught us that we often fall in love not with the person in front of us, but with the echo of something unfinished. That we don't seek love, we seek resolution, closure, completion. But what Freud couldn't give us was an escape. He illuminated the pattern, but he didn't teach us how to stop repeating it. That part is yours, because now you know. The emotionally unavailable man isn't rare. He's just familiar. He's just the stand-in for an unmet need, for a silence you've been trying to fill. So what happens when you stop chasing what hurts? What happens when you stop assigning worth to someone based on how hard they are to reach? What kind of love could exist if it didn't have to prove itself through suffering? The answer won't come from theory, it won't come from another script. It will come from awareness, from standing still long enough to see what you've been running toward and what you've been running from. Freud once said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." That darkness, your unconscious, your patterns, your past, has been running the show, but now it's in the light. And from here, you get to decide, not who to chase, but who you're finally ready to become. If this video hits somewhere you can't quite explain, it was meant to. Like, comment and subscribe for more truths they don't teach you in school.